Mirëmbrëma shikues të nderuar të Këndit të debatit, sonte të ftuar kam gazetarin britanik Julius Strauss, I cili për Tëvë1 do ta rrëfej përvojën e tij gjatë luftës së fundit në Kosovë. Mr. Strauss, can you tell us more about your career as a journalist? When was the moment that you were interested to begin a career as a journalist which wants to follow from the war of the conflict zones?
I mean, it came together slowly. It started out, my father was born in Hungary and he fought against the Soviets in 1956 and then he became a refugee. And both my grandfathers fought in the Second World War. So I suppose as a child, I was kind of aware that there were wars and I grew up in the context of that, but I never thought that I would be particularly interested in war. And then I was in Hungary in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down and the war started in Yugoslavia, initially in Croatia. And I think I was curious as to what it was like. I can't say that I had a special desire to be there, but I was curious as to what it would be like and feel like. And so I started going down and looking at what was happening and trying to write stories about it. And I got scared and I came home and then I would sit at home and then I'd go back and look a bit more. And so slowly I got caught up in this thing and it felt like something important to do, something that gave my life some meaning maybe. There was a bit of excitement at the beginning and then later I very much found that it was something I believed in.
During the 19th, we had many bloody wars in Balkans. The first attention that many Western journalists covered the stories were about the Bosnian War. So may I ask you, when was the first time you heard about Kosovo? And when was the first time that you started to get interested in the Balkan Wars?
So I went to Croatia in 1991 a tiny bit, and then I went to Sarajevo in 1992. And that was when I got interested in the Bosnian War. But I was very young and I didn't have a newspaper contract or anything like that. So I didn't go very much. And then at the end of 1992, I was in northern Bosnia in a place called Bosanski Brod. And I had a bad experience and I got very scared and I decided I wouldn't go back to war again. And I didn't go back for 1 or 2 years, but then by 1995, I felt that I should go back. So I went back to Bosnia. And then, of course, the Bosnian War finished at the end of 95. I moved to Sarajevo. I lived there for 2 years. And when the Kosovo War started, I was aware that there was tension in Kosovo, but I hadn't been here. When the Kosovo War started, I was actually in Canada. And I was learning to fly airplanes, which is an enthusiasm of mine, and the war started here, and I thought, okay, maybe I should go back to the Balkans. So I actually arrived about probably 2 months late for the war. I arrived in the early summer of 1998.
And what was the feeling like the first days when you entered Kosovo, like a new place? How was the feeling?
You know, in the beginning of 1998, as you know, there was the Pleq massacre. But when I came in the early summer, things had calmed down a little bit. The KLA controlled quite a lot of the countryside, especially in the Drenica area, and there wasn't that much fighting. So in a way, I had a kind of a soft entry into the war. There was some fighting, but it wasn't very large scale. And so that was what I got used to at the beginning. But then, of course, coming into the late summer, into the autumn, it began to change and it began to get much more serious.
Yeah. And during the time you were reporting about the lost war in Kosovo, you also were a witness of one of the most terrible massacres that happened in Kosovo, which was in Abri, in the region of Drenas. There, more than 20 members of the Deliu family were killed. Also, we have the paper from the archives where you were writing for the Daily Telegraph there. So could you tell us how you went there and how was your experience reporting for that family, which they lost more than 20 members?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this one is actually from Pleq, which is later. So I covered several different massacres. Yeah. And yes, Abri was the first big massacre I covered. I mean, I wasn't there when it happened, and I wasn't even there immediately after it happened. My colleague, Vaughan Smith, was there. So I didn't get there until several days later. But then I met Deliu, who was the uncle of a little boy called Besnik, who was the oldest survivor of the massacre. And somehow I was captivated is not quite the right word, but I felt that this story had to be covered, that it had to be followed. And I was working with Leman, who was my translator, and we worked very well together as a team. And Umer took us to the site of where he had buried the bodies after the Abri massacre. There were 23 victims. And while we were at the site, we were standing there. It was very depressing. It was a very, very sad scene. You know, the graves of lots of women and children, and some very young children. And while we were there, the Serbs were still based in Likovce, which was only 1 or 2 kilometers away. And they started first shooting at us, and then shelling the place with mortars. And that I think that made me really, really angry. I mean, I was angry before, but that really irritated me. So I came back to Pristina that day, and I remember going live on BBC Lunchtime News. I didn't work for the BBC. I worked for the Daily Telegraph, but I went on BBC Lunchtime News and reported what was happening. And then I maintained the relationship with that family for months and months and months. I would go back fairly regularly. Part of it was probably a journalistic motivation. Part of it became eventually a sort of a humanitarian or almost a friendship, really.
Yeah, so how close now you are to family, and especially to Besnik? We heard the story of you that after 2 decades, the Besnik sent you a message. Can you explain to us how was like the feeling when you received a message after 20 years from the guy who were reporting from the war?
It was a very, very strange feeling. So back in 1998 and early 1999, I went to see Besnik quite a lot, and I went to see, other members of the family, and I did what I could to help where I could. I took a psychotherapist called Lynn, who was in the end very influential and she did a great job. And I took them little presents and that kind of thing. And then during the air war, when NATO was bombing Kosovo and Yugoslavia, I didn't see them. And then I went back and found them again at the end of the war. And we stayed in contact for probably another 2 years, I think, a year or two. I remember going to a wedding 1 or 2 years after the war, when Besnik would have been around 7 years old. And then we lost contact. In those days, there was no internet, there was none of these social media, so it wasn't unusual to lose contact. And I went off, I covered lots of other wars. I worked in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in Iraq, in Sierra Leone. I didn't forget about Kosovo, but it wasn't the place that I was working. And then eventually, after, having been doing this job for 15 years, I decided that was enough. My head was a little bit fried. I'd kind of had enough. And so I moved to Canada. And in Canada, I lived completely differently. I lived in the middle of nowhere with a wonderful woman called Këndin. And we built a little business, a tourism business for people who wanted to go into the wilderness and look at the wilderness, look at wild animals, especially bears. And then one day, many, many, many years later, I was sitting at my computer and this thing popped up on the screen and it said, in Albanian, it said, hello, I'm Besnik Deliu, do you remember me? And I was shocked. I remember feeling this great shock. And I sat down, I was thinking, and my wife, Këndin, came in and she said, what is it? What happened? And I explained to her. And she said, you look a little bit worried. And I said, well, I am a little bit worried because I don't know what it's going to be like to meet him again after all this time. It's been a long time.
And there is a photo of Besnik, small Besnik here.
Yeah.
So basically, you are saying that this story touched you a lot. So for a while, you took a break from journalism, right?
Yeah, I was involved in 2004. I was in southern Russia in a place called Beslan, and there was a terrible school siege. 50 people were killed, including 170 children. And I was one of very few journalists who got through the security cordon, and we saw this. And after that, I decided I needed some time off. So yeah, I definitely needed some peace and quiet in my life. So that was why I went to Canada. And at that point, I didn't intend to come back to war zones. I wasn't really thinking about war zones or places that I'd been. But when I got this message from Besnik, I thought, yeah, maybe that's something I should go back to.
So once again, you are back in Pristina. So can you tell us the reason why you came back again? You were working in a massive project, a documentary film. Can the public know more about this documentary? So yes, there's a photo of you with the Besnik.
Yes.
Yeah, it's...
Yeah, so Besnik contacted me and he said I'd like to meet again, and I told my daughter Emma that I would come back, and I told her the whole story. I'd probably told her the story before, but I told her again, and she said I'd like to film this. I'd like to film it and maybe make a documentary film. I didn't know how difficult it is to make a documentary film. If I'd have known, maybe I'd have said, no way. But I said, okay. So we started this. So this was 2 years ago now, and it's taken us 2 years to make this film. We came back, we met with Besnik, and we met with Umar, the uncle, and we re-interviewed them. We talked about what had happened at the time and what had happened in their lives since, and how things had developed, how things had changed, how they dealt with the memory of these terrible things. Yeah, here we are 2 years later, and we've made a documentary, which I think is very interesting.
So it was quite challenging to get to documentary making, even after like 2 decades. Like it's been very challenging, right?
Yes, I was a print journalist. I mean, all I had to do was write. I could barely even take photographs. So documentary was something completely new to me. The way you make it, the rules of the game, the technology, everything was kind of new. I understood narrative, I understood storytelling, I understood the power of stories, but I didn't understand the technical side of how you put things together. So I worked with my daughter Emma and an old university friend called Donald, who made films, and also with Vaughan Smith, who was here during the war, and he filmed some of the most famous footage from Kosovo. He filmed Prekaz. He was actually shot in Prekaz, and he filmed some of the other footage. So Vaughan contributed to this documentary, the archive of what he was shooting back then. And so those were the ingredients. And then lots and lots of work, lots of interviews with Umar and with Besnik and with Arlinda, his sister. And slowly we put the whole thing together.
And during this process, did you have any support from Kosovo institutions?
No, we haven't had any support from Kosovo institutions. We have had a very generous donation from a private donor who called me up out of the blue, and he said, he's a Kosovo Albanian. He said, I've heard what you're doing, and I'd like to contribute, which was very nice. And we've had a few smaller donations for some of the costs around hosting the documentary, but the documentary itself, no, we've decided to fund that ourselves.
Yeah, and can you tell us tomorrow during the event who is going to be present? Are there other journalists?
So tomorrow in the afternoon,
basically, who are the speakers tomorrow during the event?
Yeah, so tomorrow in the afternoon we're going to do 2 workshops. One is on at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and they're open to the public. So at 2 o'clock, one of them is on life after war, and one of them is on war reporting. So I will be there, Vaughan Smith will be there, the cameraman who did some of this incredible work. My daughter Emma will be there, Umar, and Fadi Mutroli will also be there, the man from pleq who suffered this terrible massacre. So one is at 2, one is at 3. And then in the evening, we're going to show the documentary. The documentary will be by private invitation only. It's not going public yet, but anybody is welcome to come to the workshop events.
So I just want to go back again to the war, and I want to ask you, like, how important was the role of Western journalists, especially for the case of Kosovo, to tell the world like what's going on in this region?
I mean, I think the role of journalists is extremely important, and not all wars work out the way we want them to. A lot of wars don't work out the way we want them to. But in the case of Kosovo, I think one of the reasons for optimism for Kosovo Albanians, or one of the reasons to be happy amidst all the sadness that happened, was that the end result was something that was positive for Kosovo and for Kosovo Albanians. That very often doesn't happen. I also think that the role of the media in the Kosovo war was probably greater than in any other war that I covered.
Why do you think that Kosovo took so much attention from the big medias of the West?
Well, I think one of the first things was that, it came against the background of Bosnia. And in the beginning, people didn't pay that much attention to Bosnia, but it was a horrible war, and between 100 and 200,000 people were killed. And of course, Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader, had a big role in the Bosnian War. He instigated, really, the Bosnian War. And so people were already sensitized to Balkan wars. So when the Kosovo War started, people already saw a pattern. And several people at the beginning were saying, we've got to stop Slobodan Milosevic, because if we don't stop him, he's just going to continue with what he's doing. And so there was a lot of interest in the Kosovo War. The other thing was that, it was a war that we could cover. I mean, it was relatively logistically simple. You could live in Pristina and you could be in Drenica in 30 or 45 minutes, providing you could get through the checkpoints. I just came back from Ukraine last week, and, I was covering the war there. And in 1 week, I had to drive 2,000 kilometers to cover the war. It's just a much, much bigger space. So that made Kosovo manageable to cover. And the technology was already just about there. We were using satellite phones at the beginning, but the technology was helpful in getting the story out quickly to the West.
During your time in Kosovo, was there like a moment, like questioning yourself, like what I'm doing here, I might risk my life? So did you have like a breakdown moment that saying that that's enough?
No,
I might go back? Yeah.
Not in that sense. Risk is a funny thing. Once you pass through it and you come out of the other side, I don't think you really second guess yourself because you survived. But what does get you is guilt. And sometimes guilt is rational and sometimes it's not rational. So yeah, there were times when I thought, I'm a journalist, I'm writing about this and nobody cares in the West. Nobody's paying any attention. Nothing is changing. It just continues. Maybe I should be an aid worker or something else. Maybe I should do something more direct. But ultimately, I think, especially in the case of Kosovo, that, Western journalists had the biggest effect.
Yeah. So you're again working back in the field. So you have been in Ukraine. Can you tell us more about your experience in Ukraine? It's been a war going on between Ukraine and Russia because of the aggression of this last one. So can you tell us who is going, and are you planning to go back again in Ukraine?
Yes, I will go back, I think. I plan to go back. I do lots of different things with my life now. So I work in Canada still with my small business. And I also run a charity project for veteran injured soldiers. I also teach young students or university students. But I do journalism as well. So Ukraine is probably the most important story that I cover at the moment. It's a very different story to cover. It's much more like the First World War, or maybe in some instances the Second World War. It's a very, very large war. We've probably had, it's difficult to say, but between 300,000 and 500,000 casualties so far, dead and injured. It's a massive war. It's very industrialized, and it's a hard place to work because there are some good sides to it. One of the good sides is that the area you're working in, you're always with friendly forces. You're not going to be targeted by the people whose side you're on. But the big negative side is there's some really big stuff coming from the other side. Some of these bombs can take down half a building. There's a lot of drones, which is something we're not really used to dealing with. They're very dangerous. So it's a challenging war to cover. And, again, I feel this similarly to what I did with the Kosovo War. For me, I lived in Moscow for 4 years and I speak Russian, and I like lots of Russians, but this is a war of Russian aggression. This isn't like a 50-50, oh, these guys are a bit wrong, these guys are a bit wrong. No, this is Russia attacking another country. Okay, there's complexities to it, but basically it's a war of aggression. So I feel strongly that that war should be covered properly.
Yeah. And talking about the wars, why do you think that there is so much attention going on to for example, the war in Ukraine by Western journalists, but in other conflicts we see less and less reporting from journalists, considering like the war in Yemen that is going on. Like also there's so much focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but we see that in other places like there's not much reporting from the journalists. Why do you think that there are certain cases when there's much more attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the public only has an ability to take in a certain amount of information regarding conflict. You're right. I mean, the war in Yemen was covered a little bit at the beginning, and now it's hardly covered at all. The war in Syria is not being covered at all. It's because we have these big two dominant wars, Ukraine, Russia, and Israel with Gaza or with the Middle East, and both of them potentially have global effects. I would argue probably that the Ukraine-Russia war is the most important war because it really is, it's going to have huge geopolitical effects, whatever happens. The war in the Middle East is also quite dominating and dangerous. But, you know, the big question with the war in Ukraine is that if Putin and Russia is not stopped, it's very difficult to imagine they're not going to continue moving forward, whether it's in Georgia or Moldova or, you know, possibly even some of the NATO countries. And I think that wakes people up. But of course, you know, it's been going for more than 2 years now. And I go back to Britain, I talk about Ukraine. A lot of people are like, that's old news. We know all about that. And I say, well, it's changing. But they've become a little bit numb to it. So communicating as a journalist, you always have to remember that it's not just what you see on the ground, but it's making sure that you can present that in a way that it connects to people at home. Otherwise, you're not really doing your job.
Yeah. And going back again to the Kosovo war, we see that during the war, many families were touched by it, but we see that there is lack of justice for many people, like the criminal who committed certain kind of crimes, they walk freely, so there is not justice. So you mentioned a bit that sometimes the justice is hard to be set. So why do you think it's very hard to bring justice and for those families that were touched by war?
You know, I mean, it's shocking and terrible that, for example, nobody has been brought to justice for the Abri massacre. And most of the people who committed it are probably sitting in Serbia living normal lives. And so I do feel very strongly that those people should be brought to justice. But one thing I would say is that I've covered a lot of wars, and there's very seldom justice at the end of wars. And one thing I really like about Deliu and his family is they haven't made justice a condition for going on with their lives. But they haven't said, we're not going to do anything until we get justice. Because the truth is, they may well not get justice. And, you know, the Kosovo Albanian victims may well not get justice for what happened. If you look at the Russia-Ukrainian war, it's the same. If you look at the Second World War, a lot of people never got justice. So I don't think we have the luxury of saying that without justice, there is no more life. We just have to live our lives as best we can and hope for justice and maybe campaign for justice, but not make it a condition of moving on.
Yeah. And how do you see that after 20 years, the tensions remain high between Kosovo and Serbia? Do you think that it has taken too long? There's a process of dialogue going on, but still two sides are very far away for normalization of relations.
You know, interesting question. I mean, most countries, most of the time, do not accept guilt for what they have done. There are some exceptions. Perhaps the most significant modern exception might be Germany, where after the Second World War, they were really pressed with messaging that they did something wrong. There were war crimes trials, and German children were brought up in school and told about the concentration camps at Auschwitz and what had happened. But that doesn't usually happen. It didn't happen in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. The Soviet Union could have done no wrong in the Second World War. Nobody ever talked about the victims of Stalin. And it doesn't, you know, it doesn't often happen. And I think in Serbia's case, they haven't taken a lot of responsibility for what they did, not just in Kosovo, but also in Bosnia. At this point, what do you do about that? I think you probably have to work with it, because imposing it from the outside is very, very difficult. Now, you can incentivize certain behavior. If they want to join the European Union, maybe you can encourage them to do certain things. But yeah, it's been 20 years, and sometimes it does feel here as if the war has just finished. It's a very, very difficult balance, this thing about honoring the past, respecting the past, learning about the past, and moving on and moving forward with your lives. And again, this for me is where Umar Deliu and the Deliu family have been so remarkable and so dignified. They respect the past and they remember the past, but they also continue and live on today. Yeah. And in some ways, they're recovering slowly.
We see that still in Kosovo, the northern part, there is like a divided society, if we can say that. Like the Kosovars and Serbs are finding hard to coexist with one another. Do you think that is possible in a near future, that both communities will coexist and will live a normal life?
I mean, I think things change slowly, but they do change. I mean, as you know, there are, I think now, more Serbs living outside the northern enclave in Kosovo than there are in the northern enclave. And maybe community relations with the Albanians are not great, but, you know, I went to Gračanica last time I was here. There's no more KFOR. There's no, if there are, they were barely visible. People are getting on with their lives. You know, is there some kind of reconciliation that is slowly getting better? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. Maybe not. And maybe that's too much to hope for after something so dramatic. Maybe it does take time. You know, even in Northern Ireland, it takes time. It takes a long time. Sometimes it takes a new generation to come through. What's going to happen? We'll have to wait and see. You know, in Ukraine, this war with Russia is forming the basis of a new Ukrainian national identity. Things are changing. That country is becoming, it's kind of almost the birthplace of modern Ukraine. I went to Kharkiv in the north a year ago and everybody spoke Russian to me. Now everybody speaks Ukrainian. You know, identities develop and identities change. But in terms of looking into the future, I think you have to be very careful what you predict. Predictions are always easy, but of course, they very seldom come out the way you think they will.
Yeah, and I want to move to the last question. There are many international experts who believe that the security situation in the Western Balkans is still fragile. We see that NATO has put more troops, especially in the northern part of Kosovo, in the border with Serbia. So do you think there is a risk for a conflict in the region? Also, the situation is very fragile in Bosnia and Herzegovina. How do you see that, and do you think that a conflict might occur once again in this troubling region?
I think it's possible that a conflict could occur either in northern Kosovo or in Bosnia, but I don't think it's very likely. You know, as somebody who covered the beginning of those wars, there were a lot of pieces that had to be in place for a war, a big war, to happen. You know, in Bosnia, it wasn't just a matter of a few nationalists getting together and doing something. They had to get weapons. They had to have a state that supported them, which in that case was Serbia. It had to be organized. You had to almost kind of move whole elements of society around. If you look at the people who led the war in Bosnia, the Serbs that led the war, they weren't the elite of the Serbian communities. These were kind of lowlife that they found somewhere and managed to push up through the system. So it takes quite a lot for a war to happen. And a lot of people are pessimistic about the Balkans. I'm not. I'm actually a bit more optimistic. Not because things are great. They're not. They're okay. But I don't think that large-scale war is about to break out. I also think that it's a slightly different, you know, I love Bosnia. I spent a lot of time there and I went back recently. Bosnia is still, the mood is very depressed. But in Kosovo, it's not. I mean, you guys are optimistic. You're looking to the future. There's a buzz and an energy about Kosovo that even with the war, you're still forward-looking and there seems to be more optimism for the future here. So I'm not going to promise there'll be no conflict, but my guess would be, if there is, it certainly won't be as big as the one that there was.
Yeah, just to the last question to add, just one more thing. Do you think it's in the responsibility of the youth generations to change this kind of mentality in the region.
It is in a way, but everybody always sort of puts it on the youth and says, you have to be the future of our country. And sometimes that works and young people, they move on and they get over the past, but sometimes it doesn't. And, if you look at Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, things seemed to be getting better and better and better. And then suddenly they took a big turn for the worse. Maybe a slow turn, but nevertheless a big turn for the worse. And, Russia today is in a terrible condition, even as it's causing this massive destruction around it. And Russian society itself is suffering too. So I hope that the youth can be a sort of a leading influence in the future and a positive influence. But history is not always that simple.
I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Pra, kaq kishim nga kjo intervistë me gazetarin britanik Julius Strauss, unë ju falenderoj për vëmendjen.